He pressed his palm against his chest. Then he pressed it against mine. And then he walked into the forest to die. I never saw him again, but I'm getting ahead of myself, because what I'm about to tell you isn't just about how I lost my best friend. It's about what he showed me before he left. Something hidden beneath the Cascade Mountains. Something that rewrites everything we think we know about human history. I am 78 years old. For 43 years, I have kept a secret. My wife went to her grave without knowing. My children have no idea. But I'm dying now. The doctors made that clear. And I cannot leave this earth without someone knowing what I discovered in the summer of 1982. When I followed a creature into darkness and found something that should not exist. I was 35 that summer, recently divorced, 7 years of marriage suffocated by my drinking and the things I'd seen in Vietnam. I bought 47 acres outside Concrete, Washington, remote land, accessible only by an abandoned logging road. No electricity, no running water, just a half-collapsed cabin that someone started building in the 60s and never finished. I told myself I was going there to rebuild, to dry out, to find peace. The truth was simpler and sadder. I had gone there to decide whether I wanted to keep living at all, but something else was already living on that mountain, and it had been watching me from the moment I arrived. The first 3 weeks, I worked until my hands bled, replacing boards, reinforcing foundations, patching the roof. The labor kept my mind quiet during the day. The nights were harder. I rationed my whiskey, 3 drinks, no more, sitting on what remained of the porch, listening to sounds I'd never heard growing up in Tacoma. Then the 4th week came, and things started going wrong. Tools moved when I wasn't looking. Food vanished from my cooler despite the heavy rocks on the lid. I found footprints near the creek. They looked almost human, but they measured 19 inches from heel to toe. I told myself it was bears. What else could I tell myself? But here's what I didn't know yet. Those footprints weren't from one creature. They were from dozens, and they led somewhere no human had ever been. July 14th, 1982. I remember the date because it was my mother's birthday. I'd been looking at her photograph, the only one I brought, taken at my high school graduation in 1965. She'd passed that spring. Her inheritance bought this land. The moon was nearly full, bright enough to cast shadows. I'd built a small fire near the cabin. Around 11, I heard movement in the tree line. Too deliberate for wind, too heavy for deer. I grabbed my father's Remington 870 and returned to the fire. What stepped out of the trees was not a bear. The creature stood at the edge of the firelight, motionless, 8 feet tall, covered in dark reddish-brown hair, longer on the arms and shoulders, shorter on the massive chest. Its face was broad, flat, heavy brow ridge, nose wider than any human nose I'd ever seen. But the eyes held me paralyzed. They were intelligent, curious, and somehow sad. I don't know how long we stared at each other. My hands shook so badly the shotgun rattled, but it made no aggressive move. It just watched me, head tilted, evaluating. Then it did something that shattered everything I thought I knew about the world. It raised one massive hand, pressed it flat against its chest, held it there, then stepped backward into the shadows. A gesture, a deliberate, meaningful gesture, and then it was gone, silent as smoke between the trees. But what did that gesture mean? I wouldn't understand for months. When I finally did, it changed everything. I didn't sleep that night, sat with my back against the cabin wall, shotgun across my knees, watching the tree line until dawn. By sunrise, I'd made a decision. I wasn't going to report what I'd seen. I wasn't going to tell anyone. I was going to find out what that creature was and where it came from. What I didn't know was that the creature had already made a decision about me. He'd been watching me for weeks before that first encounter, studying me, testing me. And he'd seen something that convinced him I was different. I wouldn't learn what that something was for 5 more years. The days that followed consumed me. I worked mornings, spent afternoons exploring, looking for signs. I found them everywhere once I knew what to look for. Broken branches at heights no bear could reach, stripped bark marking territorial boundaries, circular patches of flattened vegetation, bedding sites, and always the footprints, sometimes alone, sometimes in pairs, more than one. There were more than one. I started leaving food out at night, scraps at first, then deliberate offerings, apples, dried fish, venison jerky. The food always disappeared. But here's the thing that made my blood run cold. Sometimes things appeared in its place. A smooth river stone, a bundle of stripped willow bark, an owl feather, placed precisely where the food had been. These weren't accidents. They were gifts, exchanges, the beginning of a conversation. But who leaves owl feathers as a response? And what were they trying to tell me? 6 weeks after the first sighting. August 27th. I was following a game trail up the northern ridge, rounded a boulder, and there it was, 30 feet away, sitting on a fallen log, eating berries. It saw me immediately, stopped chewing, hand frozen halfway to its mouth. But it didn't flee, didn't make any aggressive display, just watched, chewing slowly, waiting to see what I would do. So I sat down, placed my hands flat on my thighs, stayed perfectly still. 20 minutes, 2 creatures from different worlds, watching each other in dappled forest light. When it finally rose, it didn't run, it walked, glancing back twice before disappearing over the ridge. That night, I found 3 ripe apples on my offering stump. I had no apple trees. Those apples came from somewhere else. Somewhere the creature wanted me to know about, but it would be months before he showed me where. Autumn brought changes. The creature appeared more frequently. I'd catch glimpses at the edge of my clearing, early mornings, watching me split wood, repair the cabin. Other times I'd be hiking and realize I was being followed, tracked by something moving through dense undergrowth with impossible silence. I was never afraid. I recognized something in those amber eyes, a weariness I understood, a loneliness that mirrored my own. We were both refugees, from worlds that had no place for us. I started calling him he in my mind, but he had a name, a real name, one that would take me the entire winter to learn. October 3rd. I recorded the date in my journal. I'd left a portion of salmon I'd caught in the Skagit River, sat 40 feet away, pretending to read, watching from the corner of my eye. He emerged with less caution than usual, moved directly to the fish, lifted it to his nose, smelled it. Then he looked at me and extended the fish in my direction. I didn't understand at first, thought he was rejecting it, but he repeated the gesture, pushing the fish toward me, then back to his chest, sharing. He was asking to share the meal. My heart pounded so hard, I felt it in my throat. I walked toward him, slowly. He stayed motionless, fish still extended. When I took a portion from his hand, our fingers brushed. His skin was warm, warmer than human skin, rough with calluses. He made a sound. A low rumble I felt in my chest as much as heard. Acknowledgement. We ate together that evening, 10 feet apart, as the sun set, in a silence more comfortable than any conversation I'd ever had. But this moment of peace was about to end, because winter was coming, and with it, something that would force me to make a choice: his life or my secret. November 11th, first snow, earlier than usual. I'd spent weeks preparing, insulating walls with moss and mud, stockpiling firewood, but I wasn't prepared for what came to my fire that night. He approached slowly. Movements labored. I'd never seen him move like that. He sank to the ground with a sound that was unmistakably a groan. Then he extended his arm. The wound on his forearm was clearly infected, flesh swollen, weeping yellowish fluid. He looked at me, and in his eyes I saw something that brought tears to my own: complete and absolute trust. He was putting his life in my hands. I had no real medical training, just basic first aid from the army. But I'd seen enough wounds in Vietnam. This one would kill him without treatment. I heated water, cleaned the wound, poured iodine directly into the infected flesh. He didn't flinch, just watched my hands with curious intelligence. I gave him my last antibiotics, mimed swallowing. He took them without hesitation. But here's what haunts me. That wound came from a trap set by poachers near a salmon stream where his people had fished for generations. His people. I didn't know about them yet. I didn't know there were others, hidden somewhere I couldn't imagine. He stayed near my cabin for 5 days, slept in a shallow depression 50 yards from my door, accepted food and water twice daily. On the 6th morning, I emerged at sunrise. He was standing at the clearing's edge. He looked at me for a long moment, raised his hand, pressed it against his chest, the same gesture from our first encounter. Now I understood. Gratitude. Then he disappeared into the trees. But he'd be back, and the next time, he wouldn't come alone. The winter of 1982 to 1983 nearly killed me. Historic snowfall. Some storms dropped 3 feet in a single week. I was trapped from mid-December until late February. But I wasn't alone. He came every few days, sometimes with others. I sensed them more than saw them, lingering at the edge of firelight while he approached, accepting food, or just sitting with me, in silence that had become our language. I learned things about him that winter, things I've never told anyone. He had a name. When I pointed at him, then at myself, and said my own name, he made a sound. A deep, rolling vocalization I couldn't reproduce with human vocal cords, so I called him Rumble. He seemed pleased when I said it aloud. He was old, gray in the hair around his face, stiffness in his movements on cold mornings, joints worn by decades, and he had scars, a long puckered line across his back, bullet wound, a missing finger on his left hand, healed over long ago, a bare patch on his right thigh where hair never grew. Each scar was a story, a piece of a life I was only beginning to understand. But the biggest revelation was still coming, on the coldest night of that winter, when Rumble came to my door and made it clear I was to follow him. February 2nd, 1983, 15 below zero, snow piled higher than my windows. He stood at my door, gesturing with an urgency I'd never seen, desperation that overrode my survival instincts. I should have refused. The conditions were potentially lethal. But I dressed in every piece of warm clothing I owned, strapped on my snowshoes, and followed him into frozen darkness. Why was he so desperate? What could be worth risking both our lives? The answer would change everything I thought I knew. About the world, about history, about what was possible. 3 hours through terrain I'd never explored, climbing steadily up the eastern ridge. Rumble broke trail through snow that would have exhausted me in minutes, occasionally stopping, looking back, making sure I followed. When he finally stopped, we were standing at a cave mouth, 15 feet wide, 8 feet tall, partially concealed by icicles. He looked at me, then into the darkness, then back at me. The message was clear. He wanted me inside. The entrance narrowed quickly. I had to duck, then crawl, barely wide enough for my shoulders. Rumble moved ahead, his bulk fitting through spaces that seemed impossibly small. The passage descended steeply. The rock grew warmer beneath my hands. Geothermal. The air changed, humid, thick, earthy, and organic, somehow alive. 200 yards of crawling. Then the passage opened into a space so vast my mind refused to process it. My headlamp beam disappeared into darkness that seemed infinite. And then Rumble made a call. It echoed through the blackness, and the cavern erupted with answering calls. From everywhere, eyes reflected my headlamp in every direction. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Creatures of varying sizes emerging from the rock. Approaching with the same cautious curiosity Rumble had shown me 8 months before. I sank to my knees. Rumble placed one massive hand on my shoulder. Gentle, impossibly gentle. He had brought me to his home, his family, a hidden world beneath the mountains. That had existed since before any human set foot on this continent. But that wasn't the discovery that made me weep. That came when he led me to the wall. The cavern was enormous, size of several football fields, ceiling too high for my headlamp to reach. Geothermal vents kept it warm. Phosphorescent minerals cast a blue-green glow. Living spaces carved into walls. Alcoves and chambers connected by natural ledges. Hand-carved handholds. Storage areas with dried meat and preserved roots stacked in organized piles. A freshwater pool fed by an underground stream. Steam rising in the warm air. And the creatures, more than I could count. Infants no larger than toddlers. Elders more ancient than Rumble. Faces creased with age. Movements slow and deliberate. They didn't flee from me. They watched. Adults pulling youngsters close, elders studying me with eyes that held the weight of centuries. But Rumble led me past all of this, to a section of wall that stopped my heart. Cave paintings, thousands of them, floor to ceiling, scenes spanning thousands of years, the creatures hunting, gathering, raising young, animals I recognized, deer, elk, bear, animals I didn't recognize. Animals extinct for thousands of years, mastodons, saber-toothed cats, giant sloths. These weren't primitive scratches. They showed sophisticated understanding of perspective, color, emotional depth, narrative structure, a history predating human civilization on this continent by millennia. But the recent sections broke me. Images of human beings, not enemies, not prey, neighbors, trading partners, creatures sharing the forest in harmony, until the images changed. Men with rifles, fire, capture, death, the creatures retreating, numbers dwindling with each generation. The final images were the most heartbreaking. Caves, hiding, long centuries surviving in the shadows of a world that had no place left for them. And there would be fewer of them every year I returned. I spent 3 days in that cavern, slept in an alcove Rumble showed me, ate food brought by creatures slowly overcoming their fear. Their society was complex, social hierarchies, family structures, a form of spirituality centered on the paintings. They communicated through sophisticated vocalizations and gestures. I could only understand the basics, but the most remarkable thing? They remembered, memories stretching back generations, oral histories passed elder to youth, collective knowledge of everything their people experienced since the world was young and they were dying. Rumble showed me this with sadness that needed no translation. Fewer births each year, hunting grounds shrinking, diseases appearing, illnesses brought by contact with the human world. They were the last of their kind, clinging to survival in the dark places of the earth. Rumble wanted me to know. He wanted someone to witness, to remember. When I emerged 3 days later, blinking in harsh winter sunlight, I was different. The despair that had driven me here was gone. The death wish lurking since Vietnam, simply gone. I had a purpose now, a reason to live. These people had trusted me with the greatest secret in history. I would not betray that trust, but keeping that trust would cost me everything. The years fell into a rhythm. I returned to civilization only when necessary. Odd jobs for supply money, the rest of my time on the mountain, with my silent neighbors. Rumble visited several times a week during warm months, teaching me the ways of the forest, which plants were edible, which were medicine, how to move without leaving a trace, how to read weather and bird behavior, how to find water in the driest seasons. And slowly, year by year, I learned his language. Never fluently. I couldn't produce many of his sounds, but well enough to understand and be understood. That's when I learned about his mate. She was killed by hunters in 1971. He watched from the shadows, helpless, as men with rifles celebrated over her body, loaded her onto a truck, drove away. The wound I treated that first winter, a poacher's trap, set near a salmon stream where his people had fished for generations. And I learned why he chose to trust me. He'd watched me for weeks before our first encounter, seen me spare the life of a wounded deer I could easily have killed, recognized something in my behavior, something that convinced him I was different from the men who had taken everything from him. But even his trust couldn't save what was coming. I helped him bury his mother, ancient, the oldest I ever encountered, hair completely white, eyes clouded with cataracts. She remembered when her people numbered in the thousands, when they roamed freely through forests stretching from Canada to California. She died in the Great Cavern, surrounded by family. I witnessed funeral rites practiced since before my ancestors left Africa. They didn't bury their dead in earth. They placed them in a specific chamber, deep in the cave system, a natural cathedral, walls of white crystal glittering in torchlight, made from rendered fat and dried moss. And then they sang. I didn't know they could sing, never heard anything but grunts and howls and rumbles, but they sang for their dead, a haunting melody echoing through crystal, bringing me to my knees with its beauty and its sorrow. I stayed 3 days after the funeral, sitting with Rumble in silence, offering comfort through presence alone. But the funerals would only increase, year after year, until there was almost no one left. I remarried in 1991, Eleanor, met her at a hardware store in Cedro Woolley, buying chainsaw parts. She was a widow with 2 grown children, practical, kind, never asked too many questions about my mountain life. She believed I was a wildlife photographer, a cover story explaining my absences, my reluctance to allow visitors. In truth, I spent those absences in the caverns, documenting everything, notebooks, cameras, a record kept in a waterproof container buried beneath my cabin. Eleanor passed in 2009, a stroke, quick. I grieved with genuine sorrow, But the deepest grief came from watching the slow decline of my other family. 300 creatures in 1983, less than 70 by 2010. Births nearly stopped. 2 and 5 years. Disease took many. Illnesses their immune systems couldn't fight. Viruses and bacteria from the ever-expanding human presence. Hunters took others, despite my patrols. Despite removing traps and cameras that appeared more frequently each year. Age took the rest. Elders passing one by one. Taking memories that could never be recovered. Stories that would never be told again. Rumble grew ancient. Movement slower each year. Visits less frequent. The effort of travel too much. But he still came when he could, sitting with me by the fire, as we'd done for decades, 2 old creatures who'd somehow found each other across the vast divide separating our kinds, until the day he came to say goodbye. March 15th, 2023. I was 76, already feeling the cancer that would be diagnosed 6 months later. Rumble came to my cabin in early morning, a journey that must have taken days in his condition. I knew immediately why he'd come. He was dying, gray pallor beneath thinning hair, moving with careful deliberation, as if every step might be his last. We sat by the cold fire pit, morning sun filtering through trees. He reached out, took my hand in his massive palm. His skin was cool now, not warm like before, grip weak. But his eyes were the same, intelligent, curious. Filled with sorrow, I understood completely. He made sounds, vocalizations I'd learned to interpret over 40 years, and I understood what he was telling me. The caverns were nearly empty. The young had scattered to distant territories, seeking survival far from the encroaching human world. The elders were gone. The paintings would have no one to remember them, no one to add new images to the story told for thousands of years. He was the last one here. He had come to say goodbye. I wept, first time I'd cried in front of him since 1983, when I first saw the paintings. I wept for him, for his people, for a world that had no place for such magnificent beings, for myself, for the loss I was about to experience, for the loneliness that would consume whatever remained of my life. He sat with me while I cried, hand still holding mine. When I quieted, he made the gesture, the one from our first night, palm pressed flat against his chest, held there, then reached out, pressed it against my chest, over my heart. Then he rose, slowly, painfully, walked into the forest, without looking back. I never saw him again. I found his body 3 weeks later, in the crystal chamber where his mother lay. He'd made the journey alone, descended into the caverns that had been his home his entire life, gone to join his ancestors, in the place where his people had always sent their dead. He was lying peacefully, eyes closed, massive body curled on its side, the same position he'd slept in near my cabin, that first winter when I treated his wound. I sat with him for a long time, alone in the crystal chamber, ancient paintings my only company, thinking about everything I'd witnessed, everything I'd learned, everything I'd failed to do. I kept their secret, 40 years, told no one, protected this place, devoted my life to being worthy of Rumble's trust. But I also watched them fade, helpless to stop the slow extinction. That had been inevitable since the first humans arrived on this continent. I had documentation, thousands of pages, hundreds of photographs, detailed maps of the cave system, evidence that would change everything, and I had never shared any of it. The question of what to do now has consumed me since his death. Part of me wants to destroy everything, burn the notebooks, smash the cameras, seal the entrance. Rumble's people wanted to be left alone, spent thousands of years hiding from a world that would have destroyed them. Maybe the greatest service I could do for their memory is ensuring their sanctuary stays hidden forever. But another part believes the world needs to know. Not for science, not for history, something more fundamental. We need to know we're not alone on this planet, that other intelligent beings walked these forests long before us, might walk them still, in remote places where human footsteps haven't fallen. We need to know what we've done, what we've destroyed, what we're still destroying, in our relentless expansion across every corner of Earth. The cave paintings document it all, the long coexistence, the brutal ending, the kindness, the cruelty, the shared history we never knew we had. I've decided on a middle path. This account is my testimony, the true story of 43 years of contact with a people who deserved better than what we gave them. I've included the cave location in a separate document, sealed, instructions not to open for 50 years. Maybe by then, humanity will have changed. Maybe we'll have learned to coexist with other beings instead of destroying everything we don't understand. Or maybe it won't matter, because the last of Rumble's scattered descendants will have passed, and there will be nothing left to protect. I return to the caverns every few weeks now, as often as my failing body allows. I sit in the crystal chamber where Rumble lies, surrounded by his ancestors' bones, looking at cave paintings documenting a history longer and richer than anything in our museums. I add to them when I can, using the same mineral pigments his people used for thousands of years. I've painted Rumble as I remember him from our first meeting, standing at the firelight's edge, amber eyes glowing. I've painted myself, small and pale beside his massive form. Two unlikely friends from different worlds. I've painted the cabin, the forest paths, where he taught me to move like a ghost. I'm not an artist. My paintings are crude compared to the masterworks on these walls. But they're honest. They're true. They ensure our story survives, even if my written account is lost or dismissed as the ravings of a dying man. The last painting I made, 3 weeks ago, 2 figures walking into darkness together, one large, powerful, covered in reddish-brown hair, one small, frail, leaning on a walking stick carved from a branch he gave me years ago, walking toward the crystal chamber, toward the resting place of his people, toward whatever waits on the other side. I don't know if there's an afterlife. Rumble's people believed in one, believed their spirits joined the great darkness that existed before the world began, and would exist long after it ended. I'd like to believe they were right, that when I take my last breath, I'll find him waiting, ready to show me new wonders, ready to teach me things I could never learn in this brief human existence. But even if there's nothing, if death is simply ending, all the love, all the loss, all the connection fading into void, I will die grateful, knowing I was trusted by a being who had every reason to fear and hate humanity, knowing I witnessed something miraculous, something outside the boundaries of what we think we know. Knowing that for 43 years, I was part of a story larger than myself. The creature I followed into darkness was not a monster. He was a person, with history, culture, family, a heart that could love and grieve and hope. He was my friend. I miss him more than I've ever missed anything in my entire life. That is my confession. That is my truth. I pray you'll do with it whatever serves the greater good. And I pray you'll remember, we are not the only intelligent life that ever walked this earth. We're simply the ones who survived. We owe a debt to those who didn't. A debt that can never be repaid. Only acknowledged, only mourned, only remembered. Until the day when there's no one left to remember anything at all. The cave is still there. The paintings are still there. His body rests beside his mother's, in walls of white crystal. And somewhere out there, in the wild places we haven't yet destroyed, his scattered descendants are still hiding, still watching, still waiting, for a world that might never be ready for them, but might someday deserve to know they exist.